If you ever plan on creating virtual machines in a hypervisor, it makes sense to create a template and then clone that, as it saves you a lot of time. But creating a template by installing an operating system from an ISO image, for instance, can be time consuming itself. And that's where Cloud-Init comes to the rescue, because it saves you time when creating templates. Now, most Linux distros support this, and although it's aimed at cloud providers, you can also use this with Proxmox VE. But how do you use Cloud-Init to create Debian-based virtual machines, for instance? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, as that's what we'll be going over. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to create a generic template, because the idea is this is going to save me time creating other templates for the actual Linux distros that I want to use. I mean, across the board, the actual hardware requirements are going to be pretty much the same no matter which distro I use. So if I actually set up a generic template that defines all the actual hardware I need, it'll save me a bit more time when it comes to actually creating those more specific Linux distros. And I'm also thinking ahead here in terms of just Debian, for instance. When I want to start using the actual latest major version, it's actually better to start with a fresh install, so I can save myself a bit of time when it comes to creating a template for that newer version of Debian. Now, when it comes to Proxmox VE, in order to create a template, you first need to create a virtual machine and then convert it into a template. So we're going to click on Create VM. I'm going to pick a different node out of this cluster if I wanted to, but I'll leave that as is. But for the virtual machine ID, I'm going to set this to 9000. Now, the ordering that you normally get in this left-hand pane is numerical. So it's just a case of, well, give it a higher ID just to make sure that it ends up lower down in the list. And that'll make it easier to actually identify templates versus actual virtual machines. But it's entirely up to you what you do with that. And for the name, I'm going to call this Linux template, specifically because I want to be able to pick it out easier. Now, we've got advanced options below which refer to startup and shutdown processes for virtual machines, and you can set these here as part of your defaults if you like, but I'm just going to leave those as is. And if you're going to be using resource pools, well, if you've got a common resource pool that you use, you could set that here as well. Now I'm not, so I'm just going to leave that as is and then click on Next. Now, when it comes to the operating system, we're not actually installing an operating system, especially from an ISO image, when it comes to using Cloud-Init. So for that reason, I'm going to select the option Do Not Use Any Media. And fortunately, by default, it's picking Linux as the actual operating system. So we can leave that as is and click on Next. For the system, what Proxmox themselves suggest is changing the graphic card to a serial terminal. So we're going to pick out serial terminal 0 here. Now, the reasoning behind that is that you're dealing with Cloud-Init, which is really intended for cloud providers. The expectation is no keyboard, no mouse, and you've got no monitor either. So for that reason, the expectation is it would be a serial terminal that you've got. So that's why we're picking that. Now, as an aside, I have found that the default graphics card does actually work when you're using Debian, for instance, but it's better to go with whatever Proxmox are suggesting anyway. There are other options here that you can change if you like, but what I'm going to do here is to actually pick out that QEMU agent and enable it, because usually it's actually installed and ready to go on Linux computers anyway, and it does give better feedback for the hypervisor if you use it. So with all those chosen, we're going to click on Next. For disks, well, actually we don't need a disk. I'm going to click on the recycle bin and delete this actual suggested disk. The reason being is that, well, we're not actually installing an operating system as such. What we're going to do is attach an actual pre-built hard drive essentially and later down the line to our virtual machines. So we don't need an actual hard drive to install anything onto. So click on Next. How many CPUs you allocate, whether you're going to be having certain numbers of cores or certain numbers of sockets, really depends on your actual own system. In my case, I tend to find Linux computers, especially the servers that I build, they usually don't need more than one core, or at least the majority don't, so I'm just going to leave this as my default setting. There are other various settings and flags you can pick out if you need to, but the only thing that really normally interests me is the actual type of CPU. Now, it has picked out one here that we could go with, but because the cluster that I've got has actual computers that are actually identical. What I can do is take advantage of that and scroll all the way down to the bottom here and select out host. The reason for that is that gives you faster performance. You're not really emulating the CPU as such. The only thing to bear in mind is that's not practical if you've got a mixed environment of computers in the cluster with different CPUs. So whatever you pick out here, I would suggest reading Proxmox's documentation, especially if you've got a mixture of CPUs within your cluster. Otherwise you could run into live migration problems, for instance. In any case, with those options selected, we'll click on next. Now, I'm quite happy with 2 gig of RAM, but you can change this if you want a higher default setting. But what I'm definitely going to do is deselect the ballooning device option. That's definitely not practical when it comes to performance problems you could potentially run into, because when it comes to ballooning, the idea is you don't actually allocate all of the actual physical memory that you've told the VM it has. You might put a certain amount of space aside reserved on a hard drive, for example, which that can cause performance issues. The performance of a hard drive versus RAM is significantly different. So unless you're really pushed for RAM within your actual physical hypervisor, it's best to leave that disabled. Click on next. Then the network options really depend on what your own network settings are. You might have a specific VLAN tag for an actual build network, for example, which is definitely a good recommendation. In other words, you build your virtual machines in an isolated network, keep them protected from other devices, less chance of them getting infected by viruses and so on. But in this particular case, well, this is just a lab that I've got set up, so I can leave the bridge set as is. There's no VLANs. I don't need to change the MTU. That would be useful if, for example, all of the actual systems were going to be running on 10 gig, for example. I could crank that up to support jumbo frames, for instance, by default. But in this case, I can just leave all of these settings as is and then just click on next. And then we get an option here just to give you a summary of what you want to do. This is going to be a template, so it certainly doesn't sound like a good idea to start after created. Not really going to start at all, really. In which case, as long as you're happy with what you're seeing here, we'll click on finish. And then we'll wait for this actual virtual machine to be created. So you can see it's showing up over here at the moment. It's got a little question mark. And now, although it's called Linux template, it's not actually a template. So it's got the same icon of a little monitor next to it. But we're going to select that. Then we're going to select more. And then we're going to select the option convert to template. Just confirm that. And then it's actually going to convert that over to a template. And once it does, the little icon over here should actually change. So I'll just click on I was just about to click on refresh, but now you can see it's just slightly different. It's got like a little, looks like a little piece of paper or something just behind it or something. And then you've got a much smaller little icon of the monitor or computer there. So that's it. We've got our generic template created. Now the goal here is to create an actual Debian template, and what we've got so far is a generic Linux template. So what we're going to do next is to actually clone this template to create our Debian one. So I've selected this template, then go to more and select clone. Now I could change the actual target node if I wanted to, but I'm just going to leave this as is. The VM ID, it's picked out the next available ID for virtual machines, but I'm trying to keep my virtual machines and templates clearly separate from each other. So I'm actually going to change this to 9001, which is the next available ID that I'm using for templates. The name, I want to make this as obvious as possible, so I'm calling it Debian 12 template, because it's going to be Debian, the operating system, version 12, and it's going to be a template. If you're using resource pools, you could pick out a default one if you wanted to here. I'm not using them, so I'll leave that as is. The mode, I'm not sure why, but the default option is link clone. Now, there is a bit of a performance gain when you're using link clones, or at least if you've got hard drives. This template doesn't have one, so it won't make any difference. But the big problem with link clones is that if the original is ever lost, well, any VM that was cloned from it as a link clone won't work. Maybe in a bygone era that might make sense, in a lab, for instance, when you're really struggling for storage space. But personally, I prefer to avoid it altogether and just always pick out a full clone. Now, in this case, there isn't a hard drive to copy, so things like a target storage or a format really don't make any relevance. But one thing to point out is that these actual computers have got just a hard drive as local storage. Now, for that reason, you'll see the formatting's grayed out. If I go and select VMs, on the other hand, which is my NAS, that supports different formats. So, for example, I could have QCOW2, a raw disk, and I could have a VMware image format if I wanted to. But for the sake of this, we're just going to leave that as is. But it's something to bear in mind because QCOW2 will give you support for snapshotting. If you've just got a basic hard drive attached to your computer, chances are all you're going to get is that raw format. I mean, if I specifically pick that, you'll see it doesn't give me any formatting options because all it can actually support is raw anyway. So that's just something to bear in mind. But in any case, what I'm going to do is just click on clone, and then off that will go and create our actual template. So it shouldn't take too long because it's certainly not, as I say, creating a new hard drive and copying a load of data across in this case. But one thing I'll point out is that numerically things are looking a bit odd because we've got 100, 9001, then 9000. The reason being is that, well, this is a virtual machine, whereas this is a template. So Proxmox is quite useful in that it's putting the virtual machines first and the templates after, but I still like to have that blatantly obvious bigger number just to be on the safe side, as well as the name template, just in case. Because the idea is templates are kind of like read-only virtual machines. You're supposed to create a template and just leave it in that format. Don't change it again. And then it keeps everything consistent. But in this case, what we've got is just a bare bones computer, really. Certainly doesn't have a hard drive, and it's not much use without one. So for that reason, we need to create one. So if we go over to hardware, there is no hard drive because, well, we didn't create one in the original generic template. So we need to give this actual virtual machine a hard drive to use. And that's where Cloud-Init comes into play. So if we go over to this web page, and I'll include a link in the description as well as my blog, this is where you can actually get Debian's official cloud images. It does tell you a bit more details about them. One thing to point out is it's suggesting for things like Azure, you want the Azure image, EC2, in other words, Amazon's AWS service, you want that version. What we're interested in is a generic version, which includes bare metal solutions, including Proxmox. So what I need to do is find the image that I want. At the time of the recording, we're on the Bookworm project, so I'm going to pick Bookworm. I do want the latest version, so I'll click latest. And usually this is what you'll want. Debian 12 generic, AMD 64 QCOW2, because this is what we've got as a Linux hypervisor. AMD 64, in other words 64-bit Intel or AMD processors. So that's the file we want. But instead of downloading this to my computer, then uploading it to Proxmox, what I'm going to do is right click on that and then select the option copy link. Go back to Proxmox, pick my server. I'll just click on the shell. And then I'm going to type in wget because I can use that to actually download the file. So I'll paste in the URL, hit return, and it's now downloading that actual image. Now, it isn't a particularly large image, which is fortunate. It's intended for cloud solutions anyway, but that's it. The file's now downloaded. The only thing is, unlike with other hypervisors, what we're going to have to do is to actually import this actual image as a hard drive to our virtual machine. We can't just simply attach it as is. We've got to import it and create a hard drive out of it. So what I need to do is to run a command from the command line. I don't have an option, at least at the time of the recording that I'm aware of, to be able to attach an image and import an image through the GUI. So I'm going to have to do it for the through the command line for now. But basically, we're running the qm import disk command. We then give it the virtual machine ID, which is 9001. We tell it what the file is, so that's the one we downloaded. You then need to tell it what the storage is. So for me, I've got these Proxmox servers talking to a NAS. So they're connected to an NFS share, which I've called VMs. So that's why I've got that as the storage. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to use QCOW2 as the format. The benefit of that is that it allows the actual snapshotting of the hard drives, something that you can't do on just a basic hard drive. They just support a RAW format, unfortunately. So it depends on your own setup, but in my case, these nodes have got a local LVM storage, which is just a basic hard drive. It'll only allow me to use a raw image. So that's the reason I'm making sure that these go under the NAS. Because it's a cluster, that's where they really should go anywhere, to be fair. But that's just something to bear in mind. In your case, you'll have to pick out whatever your storage is and then whatever format's suitable to you. But that is the better option if you want snapshotting. I mean, you can always move this at a later date if you wanted to anyway. But anyway, I'm just going to hit return. And then what it'll do is it'll actually then go off and then create the hard drive for our virtual machine. It's a bit deceptive, I must admit, because it'll get to 100%. And now I'm going to have to sit twiddling my thumbs because I've got to wait a while for it to actually create the actual hard drive and make it available. Your mileage might vary, but for me, yeah, it seems to be quite random. Oh, there you go, it's just suddenly finished. So sometimes I'll have to wait a bit longer, so it depends. But either way, it says it's now created a disk. The only thing is, if we go to the actual virtual machine, if we go to hardware, it shows as an unused disk. So what we've got to do is get the virtual machine to actually use it. So we select the disk, click on Edit. There's various things you can change here if you want. You can even do rate limiting and so on, but I'm just going to leave those as is. Then click on Add. And that's it. This actual virtual machine now actually has a hard drive, but as you can see, the size is only 2 gig. Now, maybe in a cloud that's fine, but for me, I want something bigger than that. So I'm going to select the drive, and then I'm going to select the disk action drop-down menu and select resize. Now, I've got a size increment option here. That's something to bear in mind. Normally, whenever you create a new virtual machine for Linux, the hard drive's 32 gig. So because it's already 2 gig, I want to add another 30 gig to the size. Click on Resize Disk. And then once it's done, we'll then get a disk of 32 gig. In other words, it's added 30 gig to the existing size. So it didn't create a disk of 30 gig. It added an extra 30 gig to the original size. But either way, we've now got our actual hard drive. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that we need to change the boot order now, because if you go over to options, then to boot order, you'll see it's not going to actually boot from that drive. So I need to select boot order, click edit. I'm just going to drag this all the way up to the top, enable that, and I'll deselect the others. I've got no particular reason to boot off the IDE or the network. I just want to boot off the drive, so I'll then click OK. Now, where things get interesting is that we can take advantage of Cloud-Init. I mean, as you can see, Proxmox does have this Cloud-Init option. So this is an image that's prepared for Cloud-Init, but although we can take advantage of it with Proxmox, in order to do that, we need to add another drive. So if we go back to hardware, go to add, and then select Cloud-Init drive. You've got choices here about the bus or device. By default, it's IDE. You can change it over to something else if you like. I'm just going to leave it as is. And then you've got to choose your storage. Now, I want to keep the hard drive image and the Cloud-Init drive together, so I'm going to put this on VMs. I could change the format if I like. By default, it's picking out QCOW2 anyway. It doesn't really matter in this case, because once you actually have created the virtual machine, you would remove all this anyway. It's just for the initial boot up, if you will, and creation of the actual virtual machine later on, as you'll find out. But either way, we need this Cloud-Init drive. So I'm going to click on Add. And that gives us that Cloud-Init drive. Now, if we go back to Cloud-Init, we've got options. So that normally when you install an operating system, you've got to go through a series of questions to answer. Things like, what's the username, what's the password, DNS domain name, DNS servers. You can put in public keys. There's upgrade packages options here as well. And then there's also IP settings. So this to me is much better than the alternative method, which is to create an actual template where you go through the normal install process. but then you create your virtual machine and then go back in and start changing IP settings, usernames, and so on, specific to that virtual machine. You can take care of that here as part of Cloud-Init, so it does save you quite a lot of time. One thing I don't like is this idea of a default user account. On the other hand, I don't want a built-in user account as such as part of the build process, but there's not a great deal of option. You've got to log in as somebody. I mean, we certainly don't know what the root account password is, so we need some user account here. So for that reason, I am going to change this. I'm just going to double click on it. It doesn't do anything, so I've got to click edit. And I'm going to call this Bob, the Bob Builder. I mean, what else? But yeah, I would say something else really. I'll click on OK, and I'll give it a password, because you might need to log in to that actual virtual machine, maybe through the console, for instance, at least to begin with. But my train of thought is that it's not ideal because it's a user account and password that's kind of baked into the hypervisor setup, if you will, as such. And that's not really a good idea. However, my plan is that when I get virtual machines created, Ansible is going to come in and it's actually going to create its own Ansible account. It's going to delete this build account that we've got here anyway. So the account only exists kind of permanent, if you will, on a template, which never gets spun up anyway. You can't read it. I mean, if you had access to the actual hypervisor and you could find a way to work out what that password is anyway, it's not that big a deal, because once the VM's just spun up and Ansible's got a hold of it, it's gone anyway, so I'm not really that bothered. So it's better to me to have at least something like this rather than a default account. In any case, we've got options here to set the DNS domain name if you want, the DNS servers. If you don't do anything, what it does, it inherits what the actual hypervisor itself's been set up for. Usually they're the same anyway, so I'm quite happy to leave those as is, but you could go in and actually change those if you like, entirely up to you. Now, one thing I would certainly suggest, because it makes things a lot more secure, is to put in a public key. That way you can actually log in from a computer using SSH key authentication, which is more secure than user accounts and passwords. And for me, this is what Ansible is going to do. When it logs in using SSH, it's going to be using an actual key authentication process. So yes, it's going to be logging in with a different user account than this one I've created here, but that's going to go anyway. And ultimately, that's all that's going to happen. It'll only be using these SSH keys going forward. So at least what I need to do for now is to put in something. So I'm just going to use my key here. So this is my public key, not a private key. You definitely don't want to put a private key here. You use a public key. Doesn't matter that that's visible, because, well, to be able to take advantage of that, you need to be in possession of the private key. So this is quite useful, especially from a security perspective. I do have an option to load it in there if I wanted to, but I've just copied and pasted it in. We'll click on OK. I've got options to upgrade packages, but I'm going to leave that as is. But the one thing I'll point out is the IP config. I'm not sure why, but the default option for IPv4 is static. Typically, you'll probably want to go to DHCP, especially for a template, and maybe virtual machines as well. Because when you create your virtual machines, you could go through that process and give them a static IP address. It tends to be a bit more common to actually use DHCP and actually reserve IP addresses based on the MAC address, rather than having to go through this rather laborious process of assigning static IP addresses this way. So for that reason, I'm going to deliberately set it to DHCP. It could all get changed as part of the automation through Ansible anyway. It doesn't really matter. All we need is to get this virtual machine up and running on the network. Now, when it comes to, well, I say this virtual machine, I mean the actual real virtual machine. In this case, we're just doing the template, so it doesn't really matter. When it comes to the actual virtual machine itself, that would be this similar sort of expectation, because I don't want to go through this process of having to put the IP address in for every single virtual machine I create. For IPv6, it's entirely up to you. There doesn't seem to be a way to disable this. It's decades since I ever touched IPv6 in terms of seeing anybody who needed it. I mean, I've come across an actual hosting provider who wanted it for the customers, and that was a long time ago. It's been very common in Cisco exams, for example, to actually make sure you understand IPv6, but until an actual service provider, for instance, comes along and actually gives me the option for IPv6, and as long as I can get away with IPv4, well, like most companies, I'll just stick with IPv4 for now and not touch IPv6. But as you can see, the option is there if you want to use it. You just, for whatever reason, don't have a means to disable it. So I'm just going to leave it on the static option. Click OK, and then that at least gives me the basis for my actual template. So now what I need to do is to actually convert this into a template. So to do that, we'll go to More, and then select Convert to Template. Say yes. Off it goes. Now it converts that across from being a virtual machine and being a template, which essentially it's just a read-only version of an actual virtual machine anyway. But you'll notice how the ordering's changed. So now we've got a proper numerical order that we'd expect. Just that extra feature, shall we say, of virtual machines take precedence over templates. But there we go. We've now got an actual template to create Debian 12 virtual machines from. Well, now that we've got a Debian template created, we can create virtual machines from it. So to do that, we'll select that template. Then we'll go to More and click on the clone option. Now, I could pick a different node to install it on, but I'll leave that as is. And I could change the actual virtual machine ID, but I'm not really too bothered about this. It's just picking out the next available one, which is fine for me. And then I need to give this virtual machine a name. So I'm just going to call this Deb Test, for example. If I was using resource pools, I could assign it to a specific one, but I'm not, so I shall leave that blank. As ever, when it comes to the mode, I'd much prefer to use a full clone as opposed to a linked clone. And then it's really coming down to choices as to where I want the actual hard drive. Now, in this particular case, I know the template is on the NAS, but I can be a bit more specific. I can actually tell it that I do want it on my VM storage. I can change the actual format if I wanted to, but I want to use QCOW2 because I want snapshotting available options here. So with all those choices picked there, I'm going to click on Clone. And now I'm going to sit twiddling my thumbs because at the moment you can see we've got a virtual machine here, but it's saying that it's locked because it's in the middle of actually cloning it. In other words, it's got to actually copy that hard drive to create an actual new one. So this is going to take a bit longer than it took to clone the actual generic template that we had originally. So just wait for that to finish. Okay then, so the padlock has now disappeared, so that virtual machine should be ready to go. So we'll select that. Now, before I actually start this up, I've got options. So I could, for example, start changing the hardware, give it more CPUs, give it more memory and so on. I could go into Cloud-Init, I can make alterations, I can pick a different user account, I can give it a specific static IP address and so on. But the thing behind this was that really everything should be getting all the settings that are needed from this Debian template. Enough for, in my case, Ansible to then get a hold of it and update it. So I'm just going to leave this all alone. And instead what we're going to do is actually click on Start. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on the summary, because although it's tempting to click on the console and actually see what's going on, from what I've seen in some of the forums, you can have problems if you actually interrupt the process here. So what we're going to do is just basically keep an eye on this, because you're going to see CPU spikes every now and again while it goes through the process of essentially setting up this virtual machine based on the information we gave it in those Cloud-Init settings. Eventually what it should do is settle down. And one way I've found to also just double check is to actually check the DHCP server, because once the computer's been allocated an IP address, then it should be ready to go. So again, I'm just going to twiddle my thumbs and wait until it seems that this virtual machine's ready. Now it looks like it has actually quietened down, so we should be ready to go. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over to my DHCP server. I mean, I'm using cat here, Kia rather. So what I'm going to do is just have a look and then I'm going to have a look in the file and see if any IP addresses were leased. So it looks like we've got an IP address of 103 is the most recent release. So what I'm going to do is SSH into that as both. But because we're using keys, I need to tell it which key to use. So that's going to be in my home folder. I need to point it to the private key. I'll say yes to the actual fingerprint, say that looks fine. And there we go. We've now got access to a computer called DebTest and logged in as Bob. So that's something to point out, was the fact that when we actually cloned the virtual machine, I gave it a name of DebTest. Now, if you've actually created other templates just going down the normal ISO process, in other words, you build the operating system by going through this long, lengthy process of booting from an ISO image, answering a load of questions, and then sitting for a long, long time waiting for the operating system to install, and then you turn that into a template. When you actually then clone that template, the problem is the computer, it doesn't matter what name you give it as part of the cloning process, is the same as the actual template that you create. In this case, which is extremely useful, the hostname actually gets changed as part of this process. So that's one less thing I need to be concerned about. Now, one thing I will point out though is that there are some aspects of this I'm not overly fond of. If I have a look at the date, it's on QTC as far as the time zone is concerned. So this is something you might want to look into post-install. In a big cloud environment, chances are you're using UTC, you'll probably want to centralize all of the actual time zones anyway. But if on the other hand, you actually want to centralize that to whatever country you're in and so on, well, that's something you want to look into post-install. So it's not that big of a deal, but it's something I came across. Another thing I've found is that, well, if I have a look in the /etc/network folder, if I can type, there's no interfaces file here. Normally when I install Debian, and one of the things I like about Debian versus, say, like Ubuntu, which is based off of Debian, this version of Debian uses NetPlan, and I don't like it. I've got to be honest, I just don't like it at all. Editing a text file, to me, is far, far simpler. There is another way of doing it, and I don't like that version either. To me, text files are much simpler. But in any case, it is what it is. I prefer this approach of having a much quicker way to create a template using this Cloud-Init. So once it's got an IP address, it's not going to likely change anyway. And if things are bound to an IP address based on a MAC address, well, it's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to be coming back into this machine and changing anything afterwards anyway. But again, it's something to bear in mind. If you're not familiar with NetPlan, you're going to have to get used to it. Another thing you might run into is locale settings, more around keyboard settings and so on. What I found is that with Debian, you can run into these problems where you'll run a command and it just barks saying that the locale is not set or hasn't been decided, in which case you're going to have to fix that if you run into it. It's not specific to the Cloud-Init image as far as I can tell. I've had that with other versions of Debian as well anyway. So these are all features, shall we say, that you need to probably look into post-install. I'm just having a look for any other thing, any other gotchas. Oh yes, the other one is, although I mentioned enabling the QEMU agent, with Debian, software isn't installed, at least not with this specific image. So that's something else you'll have to bear in mind. You'll have to install the actual agent as another post-install job. Now, these are all, to me, just minor, trivial sort of things, but I thought I'd point them out. The reason they're minor is really my plan, shall we say, is to automate as much of this as possible, which means going down the Ansible route. And if this is all going to get changed anyway, it's not that big of a deal. I can have Ansible do all this. So that's why I'm not overly concerned. Now, although I actually logged in using SSH, you can also go in through the console. If I select that, eventually it'll come up and say starting the serial terminal. To actually get in there, what you've got to do is actually select the actual screen and press the return key. And then I should be able to log in as Bob. So there you go. So I can still get in through the console. So even if I didn't, know what the IP address is through DHCP, I could get it this way as well. But I don't know. I mean, as I say, I've always played it safe when it comes to running this type of image, and I just leave the console alone, just to be on the safe side, because it's booting up, doing whatever it's doing, using Cloud-Init, and I don't want to have it interrupted. I mean, if I go back again, we're back to this process of saying, start the serial terminal. Another thing to bear in mind is there's only 4 serial terminals potentially available, which can limit how many you can log into at any given time, as far as I can see. But again, this whole image is really intended for a cloud provider anyway. The whole expectation was you'd set it up like this, leave it a while, and then you would SSH into it anyway. But overall, it's a relatively simple process to follow, and it is much quicker to me than going down the ISO image route. Now, although this method saves me a lot of time versus creating a template from an ISO image, it is still a manual process. Now, there are several tools to help you automate the building of virtual machines, but these usually involve learning new scripting languages, getting the key presses correct, create the template, and so on. So for me, the long-term goal is to hand over as much as possible to Ansible. In other words, once the hypervisors are up and running, it should be possible to get Ansible to create these Cloud-Init templates and then use them to create the virtual machines. But what automation methods are you using or planning to use? Let me know in the comments below. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourself that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.